What happens when Hollywood royalty meets late-night television and the cameras capture every second of a meltdown that would end a career? In just 31 seconds, a single comment would transform a routine talk show appearance into the most explosive celebrity interview ever recorded, revealing the true character behind the carefully crafted public image. The Late Night with Seth Meyers studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members settled into their seats, production assistants made final adjustments to lighting, and Seth Meyers reviewed his notes one last time. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a softball interview, a friendly chat to promote upcoming projects and maintain positive public relations. Meghan entered the studio with the confidence of someone accustomed to red carpets and royal protocols. Her smile was perfectly practiced, her posture regal, and her designer dress caught the studio lights just right. The audience applauded warmly as she took her seat across from Seth, who greeted her with his characteristic friendly demeanor. "Welcome to the show, Meghan. Thanks for being here tonight," Seth said, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had made him a beloved late-night host. "Thank you for having me, Seth. Though I must say, this chair is rather uncomfortable. Don't you have anything more suitable?" Meghan's tone carried an edge that made Seth pause, though he maintained his professional smile. "Well, that's the same chair we use for all our guests. George Clooney sat in it just last week and didn't seem to mind," Seth replied with a gentle laugh, trying to keep things light. Meghan's expression shifted slightly. "I'm not George Clooney, Seth. I would think you'd understand that different people have different needs and expectations." The studio audience grew quiet, sensing an unusual tension. Seth, ever the professional, decided to move forward with the planned interview questions rather than dwell on the seating arrangement. "Of course, absolutely. So let's talk about your new project. I understand you're working on something really exciting," Seth said, consulting his notes and attempting to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Yes. Well, it's groundbreaking work, really. Something that will change how people think about storytelling and social impact. But I'm not sure your audience would fully grasp the complexity of what we're trying to achieve," Meghan replied, her voice taking on a condescending tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Seth raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. "Our audience is pretty smart, actually. They appreciate good storytelling and meaningful content. Why don't you tell us about it?" "Seth, with all due respect, and I mean this kindly, your show caters to a very specific demographic. My work transcends traditional boundaries and speaks to a more sophisticated audience. It's about global consciousness and elevated discourse." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Seth's smile became more strained, but he pressed on, determined to salvage the interview. "Well, we've had world leaders, Nobel Prize winners, and acclaimed artists on this show. I think our viewers can handle sophisticated content," Seth said, his voice maintaining its professional tone despite the obvious provocation. Meghan leaned back in her chair, a look of barely concealed disdain crossing her face. "Seth, I've been briefed on your typical content. It's very middle America, very safe. What I'm doing requires a certain level of cultural awareness and global perspective that might be challenging for your regular viewership." Murmurs rippled through the studio audience. Seth felt his jaw tighten, but years of live television experience had taught him to stay calm under pressure. "I think you might be underestimating our audience, Meghan. We cover serious topics here regularly. In fact, just last month we did a whole segment on international humanitarian efforts," Seth responded, his voice steady but with a hint of steel underneath. "Oh, Seth," Meghan said with a patronizing smile. "Covering humanitarian efforts and truly understanding the complexities of global social justice are entirely different things. I've worked with world leaders, with the United Nations, with organizations that shape international policy. This is my realm of expertise." The audience was now completely silent, watching this uncomfortable exchange unfold. Seth's production team exchanged worried glances from behind the cameras. "That's impressive background, certainly, but I think our viewers would love to hear more specifics about your current project rather than, well, generalizations about audience demographics," Seth said, trying once more to redirect the conversation constructively. Meghan's expression hardened. "You know what, Seth? I agreed to come on this show as a favor, really. My publicist thought it would be good exposure, though I had my doubts. I can see now that those doubts were justified." Seth blinked, momentarily taken aback by the directness of the insult. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. We're just trying to have a conversation about your work." "The problem, Seth, is that you're not equipped to have this conversation. This interview was supposed to be about elevating discourse, but instead we're stuck in this very pedestrian format. Your questions are surface level, Your approach is conventional, and frankly, it's beneath what I'm trying to accomplish." The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Seth's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his professionalism. "Meghan, I've been doing this for quite a while, and I pride myself on being able to discuss complex topics with our guests. If you'd like to dive deeper into your work, I'm absolutely ready for that conversation," Seth said, his voice controlled but with an unmistakable firmness. "Seth, please. You do comedy bits about trending topics and celebrity gossip. What I'm discussing requires intellectual rigor and cultural sensitivity that goes far beyond your typical late-night television framework. It's not your fault, really. It's just the limitations of this format." Seth's patience, legendary among his peers for surviving countless difficult interviews, began to show hairline cracks. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes had grown colder. "I think we might have different perspectives on what this show is about, Meghan. We've tackled everything from climate change to international relations to social justice. Our writers' room includes people with advanced degrees from top universities, and our audience includes everyone from teachers to doctors to policymakers," Seth said, his voice carrying a new edge of defensiveness. Meghan waved her hand dismissively. "Seth, I'm not trying to be unkind, but there's a difference between discussing these topics at a surface level for entertainment purposes and actually living them, breathing them, making them your life's work. I've sat across from heads of state. I've influenced policy at the highest levels. This," she gestured around the studio, "this is a very different arena." The audience began to stir uncomfortably. A few people could be heard whispering to each other. Seth's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "You know what, Meghan? I think our audience would be very interested to hear about these policy influences you've had. Can you give us some specific examples of legislation or international agreements that you've personally shaped?" Seth asked, leaning forward slightly, his interviewer instincts kicking in. Meghan's composure flickered for just a moment. "Well, it's not always about direct legislative impact, Seth. Real change happens through cultural influence, through shifting narratives, through elevating consciousness. These are subtle but powerful forces that someone in your position might not fully appreciate." "I see. So when you mention influencing policy at the highest levels, you're speaking more metaphorically than literally?" Seth pressed, his tone remaining professionally curious, but with an underlying skepticism that hadn't been there before. "Seth, you're trying to reduce complex social dynamics to sound bites. This is exactly what I mean about the limitations of this format. Real influence isn't always measurable in traditional metrics." Several audience members exchanged glances. The energy in the room had shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely tense. "I understand that influence can take many forms," Seth replied carefully. "But when you say you've worked with the United Nations and world leaders, our audience might reasonably expect some concrete examples of that collaboration." Meghan's voice took on a sharp edge. "Are you questioning my credentials, Seth? Because I can assure you that my resume speaks for itself. The work I've done transcends the kind of celebrity culture coverage that dominates shows like this." "I'm not questioning anything, Meghan. I'm just asking for specifics because our audience appreciates concrete information. They're smart people who can handle detailed discussions about policy and social impact. Your audience, Seth, tunes in for comedy sketches and celebrity interviews. Let's not pretend this is Meet the Press. The demographic data is very clear about what your viewers expect and what they're intellectually prepared to engage with." Seth's eyes flashed. "You know what, Meghan? I think you're selling our audience short, and frankly, you're selling yourself short too. Instead of talking about how sophisticated your work is, why don't you just tell us about it? Let the work speak for itself." Because, Seth, and I'm going to be very direct here, this platform isn't worthy of that level of discourse. You've created an environment that reduces everything to entertainment value. Serious social justice work can't be packaged into 7-minute segments between comedy bits. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Several people were shaking their heads, and a few had crossed their arms defensively. "So you're saying that coming on this show was beneath you?" Seth asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I'm saying that I hoped we could elevate this platform tonight, but it's becoming clear that the format itself is too restrictive for the kind of meaningful dialogue that real change requires." Seth nodded slowly. "I see. So you came on our show hoping to elevate it because you felt it was operating below your standards?" "Exactly. I thought perhaps we could demonstrate how late-night television could be more than just mindless entertainment, but this conversation proves that some environments are simply too limiting for substantial discourse." "Meghan, with all due respect, you've been on this show for 12 minutes, and instead of sharing any actual information about your work, You've spent the entire time explaining why our show, our audience, and apparently our entire format are inadequate for someone of your caliber. The studio audience began to murmur more audibly. A few people applauded Seth's response, quickly stifling themselves when they remembered they were being filmed. Seth, I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the realities of media and public discourse. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps that proves my point about the limitations we're working within. What makes me uncomfortable, Meghan, is having a guest who seems to think that the best way to discuss their important work is to spend the entire interview insulting the intelligence of everyone in this room. Meghan's eyes narrowed. I haven't insulted anyone, Seth. I've simply been honest about the intellectual and cultural gaps that exist in mainstream media. If you interpret honesty as insult, that might be something worth examining. Seth took a deep breath, clearly fighting to maintain his composure. You've called our audience unsophisticated, dismissed our format as inadequate, and suggested that everyone here lacks the cultural awareness to understand your work. How exactly would you characterize those statements? I would characterize them as accurate assessments based on demographic research and media literacy studies. The American television audience operates at approximately a 6th grade reading level. Seth, these aren't personal attacks, they're statistical realities. The audience erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered boos. Seth held up his hand to quiet them, but his face had gone red. Meghan, you just told a room full of real people, to their faces, that they operate at a 6th grade reading level. These are teachers, nurses, engineers, small business owners, parents who work multiple jobs to support their families. And you think that's an appropriate way to speak about them? Seth's voice had lost all pretense of diplomatic courtesy. Meghan straightened in her chair, her expression hardening further. Seth, I'm citing research data, not making personal judgments. If you want to have adult conversations about media and society, we need to acknowledge these realities, rather than pretending everyone operates at the same intellectual level. You know what, Meghan? I've interviewed Nobel laureates who never once felt the need to tell our audience they were too stupid to understand the conversation. I've talked with Supreme Court justices, Pulitzer Prize winners, and world-renowned scientists who somehow managed to explain complex ideas without insulting anyone's intelligence. Those people, Seth, were operating within established academic and institutional frameworks. What I'm discussing transcends traditional boundaries and requires a different kind of intellectual flexibility. The audience was now actively hostile, with several people calling out responses that the microphones couldn't quite catch. Seth motioned for quiet, but his own patience was clearly exhausted. Here's what I find interesting, Meghan. In 15 minutes, you haven't told us a single concrete thing about this groundbreaking work you're doing. Not one specific project, not one measurable outcome, not one actual example of this global impact you keep mentioning. Just endless explanations about why everyone else isn't smart enough to understand it. Meghan's composure finally cracked completely. You want specifics, Seth? Fine. I'm working on initiatives that will reshape how marginalized communities are represented in media. I'm developing educational content that addresses systemic inequalities at their root. I'm creating platforms for voices that have been silenced by mainstream institutions like this one. Great, now we're getting somewhere. Tell us about these platforms. Who are you working with? What communities are you serving? How can people get involved? Seth leaned forward, genuinely attempting to engage with the substance. It's not that simple, Seth. This work can't be reduced to promotional sound bites. The communities I serve require protection from exploitation by mainstream media outlets that would sensationalize their struggles for entertainment value. Seth's face showed genuine confusion. So you can't tell our audience about your work because you need to protect your work from our audience? I need to protect vulnerable communities from being turned into content for consumption by audiences who lack the cultural competency to engage respectfully with their experiences. The studio had become a powder keg. Audience members were shaking their heads openly, and several were making disgusted faces. Meghan, you do realize that you just called everyone in this room culturally incompetent, right? You've essentially said that our viewers are too stupid, too unsophisticated, and too culturally unaware to be trusted with information about your work. I've said that certain conversations require certain contexts and certain levels of preparation that don't exist in mainstream entertainment venues. Seth stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. You know what? I think I understand now. You didn't come here to talk about your work. You came here to demonstrate your superiority over everyone in this room. You came here to make sure everyone knew that you're operating on a level that the rest of us could never reach. Meghan also stood, her voice rising. I came here hoping to elevate this conversation, and instead I'm being attacked for having standards and expecting intellectual honesty. You're not being attacked, Meghan. You're being held accountable for spending 20 minutes insulting every single person in this building while contributing absolutely nothing of value to any conversation. The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Meghan looked around the room with obvious disdain. This reaction, Seth, proves everything I've said about the intellectual limitations we're dealing with. A truly sophisticated audience would appreciate nuanced discourse rather than reacting emotionally to honest assessments. Seth's voice dropped to a deadly quiet tone. Get out. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out of my studio. Get out of my show. Take your sophisticated discourse and your honest assessments and your cultural competency and get out. Meghan's mouth fell open. You're ending the interview? I'm ending your appearance on this show. Yes. You've insulted our audience, our format, our writers, our production team, and frankly, you've wasted everyone's time with your condescending lectures about how much better you are than everyone else. Seth, you're making a terrible mistake. This conversation could have been transformative if you had been willing to engage at the appropriate intellectual level. The only mistake I made was not ending this train wreck 10 minutes ago. Security will escort you out. 2 security personnel appeared from the wings as if they had been waiting for this moment. The audience was now cheering openly. Meghan gathered her purse, her composure completely shattered. This is exactly the kind of anti-intellectual response I expected from this environment. You're proving every point I made about the limitations of mainstream media. And you've proven every point I could make about entitled celebrities who think being famous makes them smarter than everyone else. Seth shot back. As security approached her chair, Meghan turned to face the audience directly. You're all being manipulated by someone who profits from keeping you intellectually comfortable instead of challenging you to grow. The audience booed loudly. Seth stepped between Meghan and the crowd. That's enough. You're done here. Meghan walked toward the exit with security flanking her, calling back over her shoulder. This is why real change is so difficult in this country. People would rather be entertained than educated. And people would rather be respected than lectured, Seth called after her. The studio doors closed behind her with a definitive thud. Seth turned to face his audience, his chest heaving, sweat visible on his forehead under the studio lights. Well, he said, loosening his tie, that was not in the script. The audience erupted in the loudest applause of the evening. Seth ran his hands through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I can honestly say that was a first. When we come back, we'll have some comedy sketches that will hopefully restore your faith in basic human decency. The cameras cut to commercial as the audience continued cheering, and Seth collapsed back into his chair, staring at the spot where his guest had been sitting just moments before.